Hi everybody, welcome back to Bentley House. Today, you saw from the title, I'm going to be making Wednesday to go along with all the other Addams family members I've already created. Cousin It was a gift from a friend, so he was actually the first Addams family member that I had. But the first one that I created myself through this doll series is Uncle Fester, and I started with him because he didn't have any hair. Then I went on to Lurch, and then Pugsley. And then Grandmama was actually a remake. Originally she was a peddler woman, but I took off her bonnet and redid her hair to make her look a little bit more like Grandmama. And then during last October, I did a video where I created both Gomez and Morticia at the exact same time, which Morticia has been my most difficult doll to date. However, now I'm moving on to my absolute favorite Addams family member, and that has to be Wednesday. This is why I kept her to the very end. I wanted my doll skills to get better and then get to the point where I felt comfortable working on her. Just like all my other dolls, Wednesday started out as a kit created by Sandra Stacy. I will leave a link to her shop in the description box below if you're interested, but I really enjoyed working with her kits, and she's the one who's made this all possible because she gave me the information on how to put a doll body together like this. Before I begin anything, I'm going to have to do a little bit of work on my fabrics. These are the fabrics I pulled out to use for Wednesday, and I decided I wanted to use a print because a lot of Christina Ricci's Wednesday outfits have prints, and I thought that would be really cool to try and put a print on one of my dolls. This print is a little bit too bright, so I've decided to take some black ink and I am going to paint over this fabric. The reason I'm using this ink instead of acrylic paint is this ink is permanent and waterproof once it dries, and so I didn't want anything that I put on the fabric to start coming off of the fabric once I started putting it onto her body, and so I felt like the ink would be the safest bet. I mixed it with some water to kind of dull it down a little bit, because if I did straight ink onto the fabric, it would just be black. You wouldn't see the pattern at all. So by adding the water, you're still able to see the pattern. Now while it's drying, I also decided to make some faux leather. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some brown paint on top of this black fabric, and then I am going to add Mod Podge on top of the brown paint once it's dried. In order to get the effect I want, I'm going to have to do this a couple times. So I have a base layer of brown paint, and then a layer of Mod Podge, then another layer of brown paint, and then another layer of Mod Podge on top of that. Once all those layers have dried, I noticed there were some little bumps on top of this fabric, and I really didn't want that, so I decided to go ahead and sand it down before adding one last layer of Mod Podge on top. Doing these last final steps is what I think really sold this as being a high quality faux leather substitute. So now that my fabric is dry, you can see how the ink affected it. This is the original fabric up against the fabric I'm going to use for Wednesday's outfit. It still has a nice print, you can see the print, but it's more a color that Wednesday would wear. And here is the final faux leather that I will use to create her shoes and her belt. Finally, I'll need some cream muslin to create her collar. To work on the doll's body, I'm going to first use a layer of Mr. Super Clear. This is going to give me a work surface to add some white shaved chalk pastel. All I did was just shave down some chalk pastel, put them in these little containers, and it's easier for me to use. Above her eyelids, I'm going to add some brown because you can look at references of Christina Ricci as Wednesday, and she does have some very dark areas above her eyes. I'm also going to use a little bit of black in the corners of her eyes and below her eyes. I like to do all my chalk pastel work before I move on to the acrylic paints. That's just my preference, but it's not necessary. Now moving on to the acrylic paint, I decided to go ahead and paint her tights on. I was thinking I could probably use some fabric to make tights, but honestly, you're just not going to see that much of her leg, and so I felt like painting it was going to work just fine. I do want to make her eyes just a little bit more open because I'm going off the Christina Ricci version. Her eyes are very big and open. I still want her to have that kind of classic annoyed look, but I do want her eyes just to be a little bit more open. I'm also going back with some black and going over the eyebrows because she does have very, very dark eyebrows. One trick when you're working with acrylic on top of a porcelain doll is you can use a little tiny pin to scrape away some of the paint if you get it in a place that you don't want. You can't do this in big areas, but if you just have a little bit you want to take off, I can scrape it off with a pin very carefully. I am going to go over her lips. Her lips are just a little bit too bright and cheery, and so I wanted to dull them down a bit. This is probably an early teenage version of Wednesday, so I think it's okay for her to look like she's got some dark lipstick on. Now I'm going to be adding the pupils of the eyes. Of course, this is when the doll starts to look like it's coming alive. I'm using some dark brown paint, and I'm just going to dip the end of a pointed tool into the paint and then carefully dot it right into the center of the white. I also use a tiny pin with some black paint on it to go on top of the brown, but honestly you can't see it in the end, so just doing this part is what really gives her eyes some life. And here is how her face is looking. And I didn't mention it before, but I do always add a little bit of paint to the nostrils to help those stand out as well. I did notice in a lot of the film stills that she had red nail polish, so I added some nail polish to the ends of her fingers. Now to create the shoes, I went ahead and filled in the boots. I don't typically see Wednesday in heels, although since this is early teenage Wednesday, she might have gone into some heels, but I decided I wanted some big, clunky, leather-looking boots for her. So I'm just going to cut a chunk of this faux leather that I created, and I'm going to wrap it around the back of her foot and then draw a line that kind of follows a little bit above the curve of her foot. Then I'm going to cut this piece out, and this is what's going to create most of the shoe. I want to make sure before I glue it back onto her foot that I do create a second piece, because of course we will need two shoes for Wednesday, and it's always a good idea to use your piece as a pattern so that you don't have to create it from scratch again. So now I have two of these shapes, and this should very easily wrap around the back of her shoe, and the shape should follow the shape of her foot on the front. I'm using some Gorilla Super Glue so that this will catch quickly. I don't use much super glue for the rest of the shoe, but if you feel like you're having a hard time getting your material to stick to a foot, sometimes just a dab of super glue will help. The rest of the time I used mostly tacky glue. Now I'm taking one side of the shoe pattern and I am pressing it over the top of her foot. There will be some material that sticks off the front, but I will cut that off later. Now I can take the second piece and layer it back over the other way, and this will essentially close off the shoe. I'm going to let that dry, and then to the bottom of the foot I'm going to flip the fabric upside down so that the bottom of the shoe looks like it has the leather that I created. I'm going to glue that securely onto her foot, and then once it's dry, cut around the shape of the foot to create the sole of the shoe. Now I've cut a very, very thin strip of the leather material, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap that around the bottom of her shoe. I cut a little bit wider strip of material, and this is going to wrap around the top of her shoe. I don't show you me doing this because it's pretty fiddly and hard to get on camera, but this is how it looks in the end. I'm creating 4 more little strips of the faux leather, and this is going to look like clasps that are keeping the boots closed. I'm just going to glue 2 of these on each shoe. And this is how they end up looking once they're on the shoes. I really do like how these look just plain, but I did want to add some metal snaps to the shoes just to give them a little bit more of an edgy look. and I wanted to use something that I already had, not go buy something, not make something else. So I grabbed some sewing pins and decided to chop the heads off of the sewing pins using a wire cutter. I did this very carefully, not getting my finger in there, but also so that metal pieces didn't go flying across the room. As I cut them off, I have just a little piece left that's the head. This is called a pick-me-up. It has a little bit of sticky tack in the top here. It helps me pick up the little pieces. I'll leave a link for that in the description if you're interested in one. It helps me hold it so that I can get it accurately on the shoe where I want it. I use Gorilla Super Glue Gel for this because it takes hold quickly. Here's how the snaps look on the shoe, and I actually like the effect that they give. Later on, I'll add a little bit of black paint on them just to dull them down a little bit. Now comes the part of doll making that can be what I think the most difficult, and that is creating the clothing. And so what I'm doing is just laying Wednesday on top of a sheet of paper, and I'm starting to draw out her proportions. And so I'm adding a little bit of area around the sides because obviously these clothes need to wrap around her body. But I am going to go through several different templates and different tries to get everything correct. So this is quite a process, so I do end up using the muslin material because if I use the material that's supposed to be her final dress, if I don't get the pattern right very soon, I could use it all up. So here you can see that I'm increasing the size of one of the pieces, and eventually I go through quite a few different versions before I come up with the final dress pattern. Then I can use those pieces and transfer them onto the final piece of material. I'm going to use a white gel pen because this is dark material. This will help me know where I need to cut. These are the two front panels of the dress, the back side of the dress, and the sleeves. To make the whole thing go a little bit smoother, I'm going to be using this Clover iron. It is a really great tool, but it gets really hot, so if you have one, use caution. What it's going to do is once I put down a layer of glue and then try to make a hem or put two pieces of fabric together, the iron makes the glue cure immediately, and so I don't have to sit there waiting for glue to dry or worry that any of my seams are going to end up popping open as I work on the rest of the dress. Once the iron goes down on top of that glue, it is set in place. To create the sleeve, I first did a hem on the very end of the sleeve, and now I'm going to be putting the right sides of the fabric together to create a hem on it's basically the long part of the arm, and then I'm going to be using my hemostat tools to grab onto the armhole opening and then flip the entire sleeve inside out. After all my practices making dolls, I've realized I really like to do the sleeves separate from the bodice piece or whatever their torso piece is going to be. I like to attach the sleeves onto the doll itself and then build the rest of the outfit around it. All I'm doing is adding some glue to the inside of the sleeves and then gluing it to her body. Now I'm going to be working on the dress bodice, and to do this, the openings that are going to go around the sleeve area or around the neck, I am going to fray check those by just adding a little bead of glue along the edge and letting it dry. In order to create the dress, I am going to be putting the right sides of the fabric together, add a small line of glue, and then put the two pieces of fabric so that they are essentially sewn together but with glue. Then I can turn it inside out or right side out and then iron it flat, and this is what's going to create the dress. There's one back piece and then two front pieces that will end up being the two front pieces that overlap on the front of the dress, creating basically like a button-up type look. I'm going to even out any of the dress hems and then hem the entire line with some glue and then again with the iron so that it looks as though the bottom of the dress is nice and neat. I've left the top parts of the dress, the pieces that usually connect above the shoulders, I've left those unattached. That'll make it easier to put on the doll. I'm first going to glue down the back of the dress just underneath her neck, and then I can flip the other pieces under her arms so that they will fit snugly against the front of her body. Now I have put a modesty band across her chest, just like I did for Morticia. I will actually remove that before I put her dress on so that it removes any bulk. Off camera, what I'm going to do is add glue around any edges that need to be snug, and then I'm going to use my iron to attach them to the doll's body. I do this off camera in this situation because it takes a lot of patience and detail work, and I really didn't want to burn myself with the iron, so you didn't see much really. I hemmed the left side of the dress and it folded over the right side of the dress, and then I just glued them on top of each other, and this is how Wednesday's dress looks so far. In order to add the cuffs to her dress, I'm using this cream colored muslin. I folded it over itself, used the iron to glue it down, and then I cut a thin strip of it, and it's just going to be glued straight on top of her sleeves that are already attached. I'm going to do this for both sides of her dress, and then we're going to move on to her very famous, iconic white collar. This is probably what most people think of when they think of Wednesday's outfit. She has a very stark white collar. So I'm taking a piece of the same color muslin. I'm cutting kind of an arch into a rectangle, and then I'm going to wrap it around the back of her neck, mark a straight line where I want it to be cut, and then I'm going to test it to make sure that this is the correct size for her collar. And this is just barely the correct size, and so I'm just going to glue it down on top of her dress, making sure I cover any rough edges that were left from the dress. There is one scene in the Addams Family movie where Wednesday and Pugsley are dueling, and in that scene she has a leather belt that goes around her dress. I really liked this look, and I thought maybe a teenage Wednesday might add a belt to give herself a little bit more form, and I think this also adds form to the dress that I have created, so I decided to add a belt using that same faux leather that I used for the shoes. I'm also going to take an old Christmas tree hook, and I turned it into kind of a C shape or a staple shape, and I made sure it is the correct height for the belt itself. I'm using my pick-me-up tool, and I'm just going to add a little bit of super glue to it and then add it on top of the belt. This is going to give the appearance that it has a belt loop that the belt is going through. Now I'm just going to use a skinny Sharpie to make a few holes or appearance of holes in the belt. So that's it for Wednesday's clothing. Now it's time to move on to the wigging, and I will tell you this is one of the most difficult wigs that I've had to create. I'm going to start out with some black viscose, some tacky glue, and some watered down tacky glue, and a brush. This is going to help me tame the viscose as I put it on. Wednesday's hair is pretty iconic, so I have to make sure and get it right. She has two black pigtails that hang down on either side, so of course, even though it's hard to find pictures of the back of her head, her hair is evenly parted on the back, and both sides of her head are identical. So what I'm starting to do is create the back part of her hair. I'm making an L shape that goes up the back part, and I'm just going to press some viscose into the glue and let it dry. When it's dry, I can go ahead and chop off any excess, and this is going to help cut down on bulk. If I have too much viscose on her head, then her hair is going to look too big and out of proportion. Once I have it trimmed down, I can take some of the watered down tacky glue, and I'm going to use a paintbrush and just brush it onto the viscose. This is going to basically glue it to the doll's head. If I don't follow this step, the hair will stick up and be very difficult to control. Once I have this glued down, I will let that dry for a little bit before I move on to messing with the bottom part of this hair. What I want to do is make sure that I cut a little bit more of this off. This is just the back of her hair. None of this is going into the braid. I'm going to fold it up over the initial glue line that we laid down. I'm going to take some more of that watered down tacky glue, and then I'm going to gently put this mixture on top of the viscose, forcing the hair to go upwards, which is the direction it would be going if she had gathered it into pigtails. So this is just creating the clump of hair on 1/4 of the head, making it look like the hair on the back of the head has been gathered into one spot. I'm going to let this dry completely. This was a lot of dry time that went into this wigging, but once I get one side correct, I don't really want to mess it up. To create the other side, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I put a line of glue, followed the same steps to create a part up the back of the head. Now I'm going to be working on the front of the hair, and this includes the hair that's going into the pigtails, so this is going to be a longer bit of viscose. I'm creating a line for the part, and then I'm going to take the viscose and push it down into the tacky glue, letting it dry. One side is going to be considerably longer than the other. Again, I'm going to cut it off short once it's dried, and then I'm just going to kind of smooth the hair down into the hair that we've already put onto the head. So what I get is this very smooth look, and it looks like the hair is just flying off in one direction. I'm going to end up folding it back over itself so it goes back onto the side of the head that we were first working on. And then I'm going to use that watered down glue to force it into this type of a shape. I'm also making sure to force that widow's peak look at the top of her head. And now you can see why I have the longer piece. It will go down into the braid. I'm going to do the same exact thing on the other side of the head. I'm putting the glue to start this process just on the other side of the part we were already working with. I'm going to put that long length of hair, just like we did before, smooth it down, flip it over, and this will create the other side of the hairdo. I'm going to let this all dry completely again so that I don't have any hair that's coming off while I'm trying to create the braids. I'm using some embroidery thread, and I'm pulling apart the thread so I have the tiniest little thread, and what I'm going to do is add glue and then twist it, and this is going to create my tie that's going to start the top of the braided pigtail. I'm using a toothpick for this so that I can evenly divide the hair into 3 pieces, and then I just started braiding. Now this ultimately did not work because once I was done with the braid, the pigtail looked just really big and fluffy, and it was just a little bit out of scale, and I didn't like how it looked. So to fix this, I went ahead and covered her again with the sandwich bag that I used before, and I'm just going to wet each strand of hair with some of that watered down glue mixture. This is going to make the strands a little bit easier to work with, and I do like the finished result. I think the braids look a little bit more in scale with what her hair would look like at 1/12 scale. And this is also going to help make sure that the viscose doesn't come undone and there's not little hairs popping out because everything's basically been glued together. Finally, I cut off the ends, added a little bit more of that embroidery thread I did beforehand, and the wigging was done. This is how she looks with her outfit, with her dress, with her hair, and honestly, I'm really happy with how she turned out. Now I do have a bit of a gift for Wednesday. I hope she doesn't mind that it's in a pink box. It was actually a gift to myself for Christmas. It's something I maybe could have made, but I knew I would have struggled with it a lot. This is Marie Antoinette. She is made by Terry Davis of Terry's Mini Dolls, and she is absolutely perfect. And it was really interesting to talk with Terry, and she said at the end of the conversation, after I had explained I wanted a doll without a head, but also I wanted the head, she said, this is the weirdest conversation I've ever had about an order, and that's when I knew that she understood what I wanted because it was so weird. But this makes me very glad that I didn't go with just plain black for Wednesday, because I think you wouldn't have been able to see her doll against her clothes. But as you can see, she fits perfectly in her arms, and I think this just completes her look. I'm not going to be doing anything with Marie Antoinette's head until, as you can see, it's very rolly, until I can find a permanent place for it, because I do not want to lose it. It is incredibly small, very detailed. I will leave Terry's information in the description box below if you want to check out her stuff. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this process of how I made Wednesday. I think my plan worked, where I started with characters that were a little bit easier and worked up to my favorite characters so that they came out the best. I do think Wednesday is my best doll build yet, so I'm so glad I went with that plan. Thank you guys for following along. I can't believe all the family members are done. They're complete. Now, I have had some people suggest making baby Pubert. Y'all have to let me know in the description if there's any other Addams family members you think I should make. They probably won't be made before I consider this project finished, but, you know, I think this might be a lifelong project for me, probably. Yeah, probably so. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're interested in following along with this project until its end. I hope you guys have an amazing week. Bye.